Good morning. There's a story about a little boy who was afraid to go to sleep at night. And when his mother would turn out the lights and leave, afraid of the dark and of being by himself, he would call out for her to come back and stay. And tired of trying to get him to bed night after night, she finally told her son that he didn't need her because God would be with him all through the night. "But Mama," the little boy said, "I want someone with skin on." And isn't that how we all feel sometimes? As we slog through more weeks of social distancing, even some of us introverts want a bit more contact with others. Now more than ever, we view being spiritually together as the alternative to being physically together on Sundays, as we are now. And what we want is the physical presence of people with skin on, when an invisible, untouchable God seems just a little too far away, a little too insubstantial to provide comfort in the dark. Sure, we know we're never alone, but there are still times when we're scared, times we don't feel God nearby. When we pray to God and our prayers aren't answered the way we want, or it seems like they're not being heard at all. When someone we love dies and all we can feel is our own grief. When we despair over a struggling child or an aging parent, when we're isolated and lonely. There are times in all of our lives when God can feel really far away, when mere spiritual presence just doesn't seem like enough, when what we want is someone with skin on. Physicality is important. It's actually important to God. God created the tangible, material world, and the very first thing God called it was good. Paul makes a point of this in his speech, his sermon this morning to the Athenians, because, like us, the Athenians tended to have this dualistic view of the world. In their view, physical and spiritual were opposites. And in the contrast of physical and spiritual, they thought the body was inferior. We too can easily fall victim to this dualistic line of thinking. After all, our bodies are so easily damaged. They hurt and break and get sick and age and fail. Life would be so much easier if we didn't have to worry about these bodies, if we could be just satisfied with spiritual food. Which is why what Paul says today is actually quite shocking. To the Athenians and to us who believe in the immortality of the soul, Paul is preaching about a Jesus resurrected with a physical body that still had scars and wounds. It doesn't sound like very good news to them. Paul is affirming that our physical existence is important to God, that our physical bodies made in God's image are important to God. And while it's true that when we are in pain or our bodies break down, we look forward to no longer being hindered by them, the whole point of the resurrection is that embodiment, having a body, is valuable and important. The whole point of the resurrection, the point of Easter, which we are still celebrating, lies in making whole that which was broken, not in doing away with it entirely. But why? Why would God do that? God is certainly capable of creating a brand new body or even no bodies at all for us to live. So why? To understand that, we must first understand, like the Athenians, that what we think we know isn't the whole story. You see, Paul is in Athens this morning, and he's preparing to meet up with Timothy and Silas, and he apparently has a couple of days to spare. So he takes the opportunity to do some sightseeing, and he notices something: a temple dedicated to an unknown god. This is remarkable because it's an indication, an admission even, that the Greeks don't know everything about God, and they know they don't know everything about God. And in fact, just before we get to the passage we read today in Acts, they actually come to Paul and say, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. And so Paul has to give them credit for that, for being open to the unknown. Because Paul, of all people, knows personally how dangerous it is when we think we know God, when we think we have God all figured out. Paul thought he had God all figured out, and he oversaw the stoning of Stephen that we read about in Acts last week. He personally carried out the active persecution of Jesus' followers right up until the very minute he was struck blind on the road to Damascus. So Paul knows firsthand that acknowledging that we don't know everything leaves us open to see what God is doing that is unexpected. And that brings us to Jesus. God's totally unexpected answer to the problem of existing in a dangerous and disappointing and finite physical world. A world where diseases threaten and time eventually destroys everything. A world where we have divided up the physical and the spiritual and pitted them against each other. God showed up with skin on. God seemed so unknown, so far away, because we forgot after Eden. We forgot that, in fact, God permeates and infuses everything. That in God, everything lives and moves and has its being. It's a hard concept for us to grasp. It's too big. And that's where Jesus comes in. God on a small, personal, intimate scale. A living, breathing example of that which is all around us all of the time. In Jesus, physical existence is merged with the infinite Spirit of God. In Jesus, we can see and remember that our entire world is infused with God. The two cannot be separated. Jesus is the flesh and blood, walking, talking, loving, physical incarnation of a God whose skin is the entire universe. And we long for physical contact because what we really long for is contact with the God who is present in every atom of our world. There are times we get what we want. I've read story after story of nurses holding the hands of people like Norman Crump, the hands of others' loved ones in the ICU. And Norman's wife said, "We can't be there. I can't touch my husband. I can't whisper in his ear and encourage him. But these people are taking the place of our family. They have a calling." There are times we get to let other people be Jesus for our loved ones. Times when we get to be Jesus for each other. A little bit of God's skin for another person. But, like the little boy calling for his mom for the umpteenth time, there are times we don't get what we want. We want to have birthday parties and graduations. We want to see friends in person and go on vacation with family. We want to hold our parents and our children. We want our loved ones to die surrounded by family, not in hospitals or nursing homes without us. If you Google dying alone, you'll get hundreds of painful stories of people terrified, heartbroken, racked with guilt by the very idea. We have a vision of what death should look like for our loved ones, for ourselves, and living and dying alone without a hand to hold, without someone with skin on, is not what we want. Jesus' disciples felt the same way. They didn't want him to die nailed to a cross next to two criminals abandoned by his friends. Which is why, in our gospel this morning, Jesus reminds us we are never alone. When Jesus' time on earth was ending, as it does for all of us, he promised we would not be orphaned. He promised an advocate. Advocate is a funny word. We often think that it means someone to intervene on our behalf, as if a faraway, invisible God sitting up in heaven was intent on punishing us, and this advocate will plead our case, and then maybe God will let us off the hook. But that's not what Jesus meant at all. The advocate doesn't advocate for us. The advocate advocates for God. The advocate advocates for God in our lives, moving in and around and through our lives so that we see more and more in the world around us the God we long to touch. The Greek word is actually parakletos, which means one who stands beside. The advocate, the Spirit, stands beside us, walks beside us, sits next to us during school plays and dance competitions, in church and in the car, at the table when we eat a meal, and in the dark when we go to bed. And every step of the way, the advocate advocates for us to become deacons, or sew masks, or protect the earth, or feed the hungry in our community, or just pray. And yes, the advocate is invisible, a spirit that the world cannot see. But the advocate reminds us that our physical existence has purpose, a reason. That in God we live and move and have our being. And in the world we also live and move and have our being, because the world does not stand in opposition to God. The world is an expression of God. The advocate continues to remind us of the truth that Jesus embodied. Earth is crammed with heaven. The very presence of God in every cell, in every plant, in every person. God is in the fabric of the bed sheets and the fabric of the universe. The advocate stands beside every one of us, even now. There is no one on earth who lives alone. There is no one on earth who dies alone. As a baby in the womb lives and moves and has its being within a mother whose face it does not know, so we live and move and have our being within our Creator, who sustains us and from whom we are never parted. And when we are finally born away from this existence, we are assured we will see God, whose voice we know, face to face, smiling down into ours. Amen.